Our next speaker is one of the most important legal activists of the 20th century. You're saying, 20, that's big. I'm not prone to hyperbole, generally speaking. A big characterization, to be sure, and one that the passage of time, frankly, will be required for clarification, which is not surprising for people who are ahead of their time. Until then, we have the benefit of his wisdom and experience with us this morning. Daniel Sheehan has the kind of vitae that fills notebooks. You download it and try to find some time to read it later. When you have a chance, please do so. Let's just say that after obtaining 3 degrees from Harvard, he has been a very, very busy man. Of particular relevance is this. In 1994, Daniel defended Dr. John Mack before a review panel of the Harvard Medical School in the wake of Mack's book, Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens. This was not his first nor his last encounter with a matter of extraterrestrial-related phenomena. In 1977, while General Counsel to the United States Jesuit Office of Special Ministry in Washington, D.C., he served as a special consultant to the U.S. Library of Congress Congressional Research Office project on extraterrestrial intelligence. Did you know they had one of those? You might not have known that. Ordered up by President Jimmy Carter. In this capacity, he was given access not only to the classified portion of the United States Air Force's infamous Project Blue Book files, but to the confidential report prepared by the Science and Technology Committee of the United States Congress by the Library of Congress Congressional Research Office pursuant to this presidential assignment. What he saw changed his life. His ongoing projects include the New Paradigm Institute, which will bring the most promising new knowledge from a wide variety of fields, including physics, ecology, religion, and philosophy, directly to bear on a wide spectrum of American public policy issues.
And he also remains General Counsel and a Director of the Institute for Cooperation in Space. Daniel Sheehan believes that keeping weapons out of interplanetary space is one of the most important contributions we can make in the future of this planet and the future of the human race. Please welcome Daniel Sheehan to X Conference 2007.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. Well, as Stephen pointed out, most of you had had your initial encounter with me in the context of my representing Dr. John Mack when he had the major confrontation at Harvard University when he published his book. And later, I served as legal counsel for the Disclosure Project, as Stephen pointed out. But what most people don't know is that I spent 20 years in Washington, D.C., first serving as the general counsel for the Jesuit Office of National Social Ministry, which had to do with the legislative office of the major 54 religious denominations in the United States, attempting to impact the public policy positions of the Republican and Democratic Party. And so it's in that context that I bring a somewhat different perspective to this issue of exopolitics. It's sort of a much more practical and focused vision of how we will go about attempting to alter the basic worldview of the American public, and thereafter, hopefully, the public in the Western world, to start to prepare for this particular upcoming event of contact with an extraterrestrial species. Now, today is the first time that I will be publicly addressing an American audience here in my new capacity as the President and Executive Director of the Civilian Center for Communication with Extraterrestrial Intelligence and the Center for the Development of Public and Private Policy on Extraterrestrial Issues that is based in Mexico City, that Stephen pointed out we have recently founded along with Jaime Maussan down in Mexico on the anniversary of the famous sighting, the UFO sightings over Mexico City back in 1999 during the solar eclipse that occurred down there. So what I want to do today in my first presentation in this context is to first try to establish, once again, which is so important, the larger strategic, tactical, and logistical context in which we undertake this particular endeavor of attempting to identify the particular types of public policy positions and private policy positions that should be developed with regard to this very special issue. So what I want to do first is I want to be able to address these things in this level to give us a context for our discussion. And well, first of all, it's perfectly clear to everyone that the specific logistical moment in which we gather here today is the eve of the election of a new administration in Washington, D.C. This new administration will be replacing the 8-year administration of George W. Bush and the neoconservative policy advisors that he has had over this period of time, in which they have been attempting to impose upon the American public consciousness and Western civilization and then the world a very specific so-called neoconservative worldview. Whoever the Republican nominee is, whether it be Fred Thompson, the former Republican senator from Tennessee, or whether it be Mitt Romney, the former governor of Massachusetts, or even if it is John McCain or Rudolph Giuliani, they will be the heirs to the legacy of George W. Bush and George Bush Sr. and Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. This has been as you know, a continuously evolving, more and more reactionary worldview until it has come to the point where we are now faced with the basic attempted imposition of a national security state here in the United States, where one gets searched from head to foot to get on an airplane. They're talking about putting new chips into the driver's licenses that will contain all of the basic information about a person that can be read and scanned at over 50 feet away, even if you're just carrying it in your pocket or a pocketbook. That this particular point in time that we find ourselves at, whoever the Republican nominee is, they're going to be carrying into future fruition or attempted fruition the legacy of this particular tradition. And the Democratic Party is going to, whoever gets the nomination, is going to be the heir to the John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, Clinton era. This has been a somewhat oscillating type of worldview that oscillates between the conservative foreign military policy to a moderate foreign military policy, from a moderate domestic policy to a somewhat liberal domestic policy. But the fact of the matter is that this upcoming election and the effort on the part of the Democratic Party to assert a significant Democratic majority control over the United States Senate and the House of Representatives constitutes the context, logistically, that we gather together to attempt to discuss the potential efficacy of an exopolitical set of public policies and programs. Now, the somewhat larger tactical context in which we find ourselves, it's important to remember that we are still in the midst of an attempt on the part of the American public and Western civilization to a larger extent to attempt to re-identify the larger worldview that is going to be adopted now that we've come to the end of the 75-year Cold War that was going on between the West and the Soviet Union. Ever since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, all the way up to December 31st of 1991, that entire basic 75-year period during which virtually everyone here in this room was raised, hiding under the desks and doing the drills and trying to see future fiction movies about the last few people that survived a thermonuclear exchange, etc. that we've been attempting to come to grips with the reality of the fact that on December 31st of 1991, the Soviet Union voluntarily withdrew from the field as the basic antithesis, engaged in a dialectical confrontation with the West at that time. And what we saw happen immediately after the December 31st, 1991 withdrawal of the Soviet Union from this dialectical contest was the immediate ascendancy on the part of a group of people that termed themselves neoconservatives, who were in fact reactionaries, who attempted to simply, since the adversary that had arisen in 1917 to confront the Western powers had departed the field, they attempted to simply retreat back to the late 19th century kind of neo-colonialist worldview that dominated Western civilization at that time, that was marked by the concepts of manifest destiny, the white man's burden, the whole effort at colonization around the world on behalf of the Caucasian Western nation states. And that these reactionaries thought that as long as your adversary has departed the field, why not simply return to your original position that had been developed in Western civilization between 1890 and 1917 and simply reassert the concept of Caucasian racial superiority, the superiority of our Western civilization, the attempt to impose these values and culture on other civilizations. And that took the form in the immediate week following the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 31st of 1991. In the very first week of January of 1992, a young Assistant Secretary of Defense by the name of Paul Wolfowitz in the administration of then George Bush Sr. drafted the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy and Planning Guidance document. And in that, he set forth all of the particulars that later became the blueprint for the Project for a New American Century. It was the assertion of the need to assert ourselves unilaterally, to not rely upon the need for any other allies in our effort, that we would eliminate any type of nation-state or non-nation-state effort to build up a military capacity to resist the superior dominance of the United States in any geographic region on the planet, even within the boundaries of any given nation-state. That they would not be allowed to attempt to build up their military forces, especially any type of nuclear forces that might realistically challenge the United States supremacy. And they insisted upon having the right to do this. And that was the beginning of the assertion of the so-called neoconservative worldview. What I'm suggesting is that was simply a return to the late 19th century Western worldview that had been challenged by the antithesis of world communism in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. So that what we find ourselves in right now is that we find ourselves faced with the challenge of this attempted reassertion of this colonialist, imperialist, unilateralist, nation-state-based, neoconservative worldview. And we believe that given the low esteem into which this particular worldview has descended over an 8-year period, that with only 28% of the population now supporting the policies of this president, that we're poised for the moment at which that particular worldview can be succeeded by some new worldview. And so the question that poses itself is, what will that new worldview be? There are a number of realistic contenders that Richard Dolan this morning in his presentation with regard to exopolitics suggests that what we're faced with is a potential dialectical contest between the assertion of power on the part of the 2% of the major transnational corporate capitalist and banking interests across the planet who attempt to assert themselves and control things through clandestine, secret black policies, and some new potential worldview, which is the worldview of the revealed existence of extraterrestrial civilization. And that this new dialectic may be putting itself into force, but he points out quite readily that we need to be very prepared for a major effort on the part of those who are in control to suppress and to keep concealed that potential worldview. What I would like to suggest today in this tactical context of this strategic challenge of the worldview, I would like to suggest that what we're really looking at, I believe, is a somewhat more complex reality. And what I would like to do is I'd like to just quickly point out, mainly, I hope they can record this, but what I'd like to point out is that, I guess I needed a lavalier or something, but the bottom line is that what I'm suggesting is that rather than there being a simple dialectic, which one of these works here, a simple dialectic between the old elitist worldview and a new extraterrestrial worldview of some kind. Oh, great! Right. That's really cool. That what we're really looking at, according to Talcott Parsons. Talcott Parsons was the chairman of the Department of Sociology at Harvard University for some 40 years. What he asserted is that we have a more complex reality, and that what we really have is we have systemic worldviews at the opposite poles of a linear continuum of this nature. And we have a right systematist worldview and a left systematist worldview. And that, needless to say, he has a middle worldview, and that there's a right marginalist worldview. He characterizes just as the most general terms that you have a left systematist, a left marginalist worldview, a right systematist and right marginalist worldview, and a middle marginalist worldview. Now, Ralph Potter, his protege, has asserted that there are what he calls a right middle marginalist worldview and a left middle marginalist worldview, which is your classic conservative and liberal worldviews that are more of a phenomenon of the 20th century. So what this gives you is a 7 worldview continuum. And what I'm suggesting is that the worldview that we're talking about, that we're gathered here this weekend to talk about, is in fact a new 8th paradigm worldview. And this is the extraterrestrial worldview. It's a worldview about which there's been virtually no dialogue, no meaningful dialogue in the scholastic and academic world at this point. They've confined themselves to this discussion of the 7 alternative worldviews. And what we're really talking about is how do we bring into this classic discussion an 8th paradigm worldview that accepts the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence and starts to prepare our human civilization for reaching out and establishing this type of contact. What I'm suggesting is that this, in fact, needs to be the context of our, I think, more intelligently informed, more subtle understanding of what the dynamic is that we're faced with as those who are going to be developing the exopolitical policy proposals to be accepted by government institutions and private organizations. Now, tactically, what we're really faced with, I believe, is the following basic reality is that if you do a sociological examination, what you will find is that inside the United States, we're faced with approximately 20% of the people are conservative, 20% of the people are moderate, and about 20% of the people are liberal. So that we have about 60% of our population here among these three groups of moderates and conservatives and liberals. So what most of the politicians attempt to do is that they're looking for these votes here. They're trying to get the 60% of the votes or so to get themselves over the top. Over here we have about 5% of the people are authoritarian people, and then there are the reactionaries, that usually constitute about 10% of the people. So what we've just seen is a major offensive effort on the part of the 10% minority in the United States who constitute this reactionary worldview to assert control over the Republican Party. And they've done so quite effectively. And what we have here in the progressive community, we have about 10% of the population in the progressive community and 20% of the population in the liberal community, and we have about 5% of the population over here in this utopian worldview. And then there's the question mark as to how many people are in this new worldview. How many people in our country, in our major generations, actually have begun to formulate some type of consistent worldview in which they're attempting to integrate the acceptance of the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence into the real material world that we deal with. And this is our task. Our task here is to attempt to identify this and then to try to determine how the policies and programs of this worldview can somehow get into this world here, where the regular politicians are attempting to vie for control of the offices and the resource distribution in our country. So that's what I'm suggesting the task is. It's not as simple as, in my opinion, as a simple dialectical contest between some old paradigm worldview and some simple new paradigm worldview. Because there is, in fact, I'm going to argue today, an interim step that we will need to go through. In my opinion, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go through a transition from the liberal worldview, with regard to which 20% of our people adhere, over into a progressive worldview, where only 10% of our people adhere to now. This is the position that's being maintained now by Dennis Kucinich. Dennis Kucinich is the person involved in the public discourse and dialogue that advocates a set of policies that are consistent with a sixth paradigm progressive worldview. And everybody looks at those things, they say, these are really great policies. Too bad they can't really be true. Too bad no one will really do anything about this. I'd like to vote for him, but I'm not going to. And so that we still have this challenge, I'm suggesting, of having to generate an adequate adherence to the sixth paradigm progressive worldview before we're going to be able to effectively get the eighth paradigm worldview really heard. And we're going to be able to be successful in getting the eighth paradigm worldview heard by members of this progressive sixth paradigm worldview. And so what I want to do is I want to talk briefly about, in preparation for discussing at the end of our talk, what the principles and policies and programs are of an eighth paradigm extraterrestrial worldview, what these interim worldviews are that we're going to have to come to grips with. And this is the sixth paradigm worldview I'm suggesting that is in the process of challenging the fourth paradigm, scientific, logical, positivist, materialist worldview that presently dominates our Western civilization at the present time. The classic Newtonian, Cartesian worldview where unless you can measure it, see it, taste it, get it to respond to one of our 5 publicly accepted senses, that it simply doesn't exist. And the only thing that we need to really compute as part of our integrated reality is those things that can be measured and weighed and tasted and seen. And so that what we're on the verge of right now, I'm suggesting to you, is not an automatic leap from the fourth paradigm scientific, logical, positivist, Newtonian, Cartesian worldview into an eighth paradigm worldview that's just going to readily accept the existence of extraterrestrial civilizations. But we are on the brink of an attempt to transition from that previous worldview into a sixth paradigm worldview, which is rooted in the discoveries of quantum physics. That the discoveries of quantum physics that were made between 1923 and 1926 by the series of people that we all know about, Dennis knows about them more than most people here, but the fact is that the fundamental realities of the Cartesian Newtonian worldview in which it was believed that the entire physical universe was made up of just these ultimately irreducible atoms that banged into each other like billiard balls. And that if you could just figure out what the exact impetus was that was imposed upon any one of them, you could make a completely deterministic determination as to how everything else is going to happen in a purely mechanical way in the universe. That whole worldview was basically turned upside down between 1923 and 1926 by a series of scientific discoveries that were made. And that what they ultimately have discovered is that the atom can be subdivided over and over and over again, not only into its this classic component parts of the nucleus with its neutrons and protons and its electrons, but that in fact even electrons can be subdivided by putting them into particle accelerators and dividing them up through smashing them together. And they can be subdivided into muons and other smaller quarks and particles. What they've ultimately discovered is that this process can be continued until such time as you actually break down every single integer of matter in the entire universe into an inchoate that is unmaterially manifest, an inchoate quantum field. And that individual inchoate quantum field will flash into material existence in the form of a particle of mass, and then out of existence, and then flash back into existence as a wavelength of energy, and then pop back out of existence, material existence. And it does this in a completely random manner. And what they have also discovered, however, is that if you take a subparticle of matter and you accelerate it in a particle accelerator, and you split it into two halves, and you channel those two subparticles off in completely opposite directions from each other, traveling away from each other at the speed of light, and you impose a force on the one of them and move it out of its straight path, the other one, moving in the opposite direction at the speed of light, will move out of its trajectory in the exact same degree. And so what they've determined is that there is some kind of a unitive bonding phenomenon that bonds together these two subparticles in some kind of a unified field. But very importantly, the most important thing, I think, of all this series of discoveries is what they have discovered is that if they, in fact, reduce these particles to an inchoate quantum field that is not manifest in the material realm, and that you observe it manifesting in a completely random manner, first as a particle of mass and then as a wavelength of energy, that if you direct human intention to that process of that particular inchoate quantum field manifesting and remanifesting itself in a random manner like that, you, through the actual direction of human intentionality, can directly influence whether or not that inchoate quantum field is going to manifest itself as either a particle of mass or as a wavelength of energy. And this absolutely undermines and transcends the fundamental premise of the Newtonian Cartesian worldview, that all of these particles of matter exist in a realm completely outside of the effect of human intention. And so what we actually have seen is that between 1923 and 1926, there was an absolute revolution took place at the very core of the understanding that we have about our material universe, and that it relates to our human intention. And what they've discovered is that the particle, the inchoate quantum field of matter that manifests itself randomly in these forms of a particle of mass or a wavelength of energy, in fact, all taken as a sum total, constitute a unified entity of the cosmos. And that this unified entity of the cosmos is in fact responsive to human intention. And that this actually represents the cutting edge of a completely new revolutionary worldview. And that This particular worldview, the quantum worldview, has been in the process of getting itself asserted at the base of all understanding of physical matter over the past 75 to 80 years, right during the same period during which the Cold War was going on. So all during that period of the Cold War, everybody was taken up with, instead of the task of figuring out how to alter our now outdated worldview, to take into account the most revolutionary revelations of the quantum era, they have been trying to figure out how to use those insights into developing nuclear weapons to kill each other off, or to kill ourselves off, more pointedly. And so what we have now is we've come to the end of this prolonged Cold War, and we have an opportunity now to take advantage of the opportunity that the old dialectical worldview of us versus them, of a thesis versus an antithesis, we have an opportunity to substitute for that 75-year-long dialectical worldview a new worldview. Now, we are being challenged by this reactionary worldview, the attempt to simply reassert the power of the elite, the Caucasian ruling class of Western civilization, to assert its dominating power over all the resources and other cultures of the world. But we don't want to, I'm suggesting, we don't want to simply get caught back in a dialectic of saying, well, they're the bad guys of the old paradigm worldview, and this new quantum sixth paradigm worldview is the new worldview, and that we ought to engage in a dialectical struggle with them. Because if we engage in a dialectical struggle with them, if we engage in a dialectical struggle against the adherents to this fourth paradigm, middle marginalist, scientific, logical, positivist worldview, from over here in the sixth paradigm, what's going to happen is the adherents to the second paradigm worldview, these reactionaries, are going to win. Because that's their worldview, that it's A versus B, thesis versus antithesis. And as long as we get or remain trapped in an us versus them, good guys versus bad guys, these people are going to rise into the ascendancy. And so what we need to do is we need to get our people, ourselves first, and the rest of our people adequately educated to understand that there is a much more sophisticated process going on here than good guys versus bad guys. That there is a process going on pursuant to which our entire human family is capable of understanding an entire octave of worldviews. An entire octave of 8 worldviews. And each and every one of these worldviews has a completely distinct and definitive set of beliefs, categorically different than that position of belief with regard to every other worldview, pertaining to a set of 10 fundamental questions that we all ask about the universe. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. They range all the way from, and it's not even probably worthwhile writing them all out because nobody ever remembers them. But the reality of it is that that's why they videotape things like this, is that so that people can remember what these are. And what I'm suggesting is that we who are involved in the exopolitical effort need to understand that each worldview, any consistent worldview, is made up vertically of the answer to these 10 worldviews. It exists horizontally with these other worldviews in the spectrum that I set forth. But the belief systems that are basically stacked on top of each other that make up this vertical worldview, first are the cosmology. This is the question of what you believe about how the physical universe actually came into being and how it is functioning and what the rules are, the fundamental rules are pursuant to which the universe evolves. And the second question is one of what they call teleology, and that is a question of how the physical universe is evolving and unfolding.
Is it, in fact, as some assume, is it just disintegrating? Is every single element in the universe that's on the periodic chart disintegrating pursuant to the rate of atomic breakdown into its lesser included elements, so that ultimately every single element will disintegrate into its constituent, ultimately irreducible, inchoate quantum fields? And is, in fact, the universe expanding out and away from its original point of origin in the Big Bang, so that the impetus of the Big Bang is pushing outward every single integer in the universe, expanding it out and away from the locus of the Big Bang at the same point in time at which every single element within it is disintegrating into its constituent parts, so that ultimately we'll come to a point where they will all, when the impetus of the Big Bang is ultimately spent, the momentum of them carrying out away from the center will ultimately expand out into ultimate nothingness, no-thingness. Now, as I've pointed out, that's a bummer worldview. I mean, that's everything headed nowhere. And ultimately what it means is within that phenomenon taking place, there are no basic ultimate moral reference. Everything is just going to hell in a handbasket, and therefore you might just as well get yours before everybody else gets theirs. And in fact, not coincidentally, it generates a mode of ethical reasoning, which is another major constituent element of these worldviews, a mode of ethical reasoning, which in fact is immediate, short-term, personal self-gratification. Very simple mode of ethical reasoning, very primitive, but it flows from the acceptance of this cosmology and this teleology. It also has its own ontology, which is the theory of how human consciousness actually evolved. How did human consciousness evolve from an otherwise apparently dead universe of simple inanimate matter? How did this extraordinary phenomenon of consciousness, more particularly human consciousness, as we are all quite apt to say, how did this happen to evolve out of an otherwise dead universe? And the adherents to the first paradigm worldview believe that this is simply a completely accidental, random event that has coincidentally occurred in the interface of mass and energy with each other. And so therefore, they don't attribute any great shakes to this. And so what they do is that they in fact assert that the epistemology of this particular worldview is that the only thing that you can tell for sure about the universe are those things that you can see and touch and feel and taste. Only those phenomena that respond to your particular sense apparatus have any existence at all. And therefore, what they do is they generate, if you take these four basic, what Talcott Parsons and Ralph Potter, his protege, referred to as the four pillars of a worldview. It's cosmology, it's teleology, or theory of the unfolding of the universe, it's ontology, it's theory of how human consciousness came into being, or it's epistemology. That is, what are the means by which we have to actually get access to the data of the world, by means of which we can possibly answer cosmic questions like that. They will, in fact, together, taken collectively, if they are answered in a way that is internally self-referential to each other, they will, in fact, generate a particular philosophy. Okay? That whole particular philosophy is usually determined by its mode of ethical reasoning. And what they're saying is that if all of these things are true, if your answer to these four questions are true, well then, how do you go about making a determination in your life as to what you're going to do when faced with a series of alternative options? That is your mode of ethical reasoning. And you put together the mode of ethical reasoning with these four things, you get your philosophy, and derivative of your philosophy is your political philosophy. And needless to say, that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about trying to understand what the differences are between the public policy positions that will be taken by adherents to an authoritarian worldview at the extreme right, the reactionary worldview, the conservative worldview, the moderate worldview, the liberal worldview, the progressive worldview, the utopian worldview, or even this new eighth worldview, the extraterrestrial worldview, that the political philosophy of those worldviews are completely derivative of the mode of ethical reasoning and the assumptions that one makes about these fundamental questions of reality. And that is why those of us who are gathered here today to talk about the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the existence of UFOs, etc., are much more interested in these kind of cosmic ideas than almost anybody else. Everybody here is interested in those kind of things. Unfortunately, not everybody in the country is, but all of us are. And the reason for that is because we have different understandings about what the answers to these questions are. And how did we come to think that there's got to be different answers to these questions? Because we come to believe that there is, in fact, a very important reality of our cosmology, and that is that there are other sentient, highly evolved, intelligent beings that exist elsewhere in the universe. And that it's likely that they've actually been coming here and actually having contact with some of our people. And we come together every 2 or 3 times a year at different places, and we show pictures of them. We show pictures of their ships. We show pictures of, we bring people out who have contact with them, and we all review this issue ourselves. And we say, now, wait a second, if this thing is true, well, then there's some fundamentally different answer to these fundamental questions. And yes, it's going to end up generating an entirely different worldview, which leads us to believe, ipso facto, that be pursuant to our different worldview, we're going to have a different set of public policies, programs, and principles than adherence to the other worldviews. And you are exactly right. What I'm suggesting is that it's not going to be, in my opinion, it's not going to be so easy as to simply get everybody to leap from the fourth paradigm, scientific, logical, positivist worldview that presently obtains today, to get them to leap over to a belief in extraterrestrial civilization. That's why the constant drumbeat that's been going on for the last 20 years in the ET community is, I sure hope they will appear soon. I sure hope, they're all getting set to come next year, 2012. Next summer, they'll all be here if we all get together again. And so that we all seem to be passively waiting for some type of a revelationary moment when the extraterrestrial beings will reveal themselves, and it will cause everybody to first go completely catatonic, and then they will automatically adopt the eighth paradigm worldview. And they'll all come looking for you to say, isn't that what you were talking to me about? So now tell me what to do, you see. And what I'm suggesting is that we should not, in my opinion, allow ourselves to be in a completely passive stance where we have to wait for the other beings. What I'm suggesting is that we establish these exopolitical discussion groups and centers, and that we begin to develop our own policies, our own principles, and that we do so pursuant to an eighth paradigm worldview. Because as long as you simply understand what the accepted beliefs are of the cosmology, teleology, ontology, epistemology, etc., of the eighth paradigm worldview, we don't have to wait for them. We can, in fact, get these answers ourselves, and we can begin to formulate the principles and policies and programs of such a worldview. And that then what we do is we reach out to them. I'm not just talking about going out and sitting in the fields and flashing lights at them, with all due respect to Stephen. What what I'm suggesting is that we undertake a full-scale, aggressive citizens diplomacy program in the same way that we did with the Soviet Union to get to the end of the Cold War. That we do not rely upon the government, that we do not rely upon the Soviets. What we do as citizens, who are the best educated people in the entire history of human civilization, is we begin to develop a conscious citizens diplomacy program in that we formulate our belief systems pursuant to the eighth paradigm worldview, knowing what its component elements are, and we develop our principles, policies, and programs, and that we aggressively start to reach out to the members of the extraterrestrial civilization, that we use every means at our disposal, including going out and sitting in the fields and flashing lights at them, and reaching out in every other possible way that we can. Finding out if, in fact, the United States government has any kind of contact with them, and if so, where are they? And what do we do about that? Reaching out to all the political candidates, trying to get them to come to some understanding about this, to get them to cooperate. But that we do not leave ourselves in a completely passive condition, either with regard to the extraterrestrial beings themselves, or in a passive condition with respect to our government officials. Because the fact of the matter is, we can't depend upon our government officials any more than we know enough what we're supposed to do to depend upon the ETs. So what we need to do is start to become self-sufficient. I would suggest that we grow up. I would suggest that we move from the most extended adolescence in the entire history of human civilization in the baby boom generation, and that we become full mature adults, and that we don't wait for our parent figures to tell us what to do. That we formulate these centers and start to do this. And that's what I'm suggesting that we do. Now, to understand what particular steps we may take, I'm suggesting that what we do is we follow basically a 12-step program to overcome the addiction that we have to this dependency. And that therefore the very first thing that we have to do is we have to understand that, as troubling as it may be, to understand that the election of Hillary Clinton will not advance this one iota. Because I love Hillary dearly. She's been a big supporter of the ERA and lots of things that we've worked on. She was a major contributor when she headed up the One World Foundation and giving grants to us in the Iran-Contra program. But the fact of the matter is that she has, for her own tactical reasons, she has decided that she is going to become an adherent in the field of foreign policy and military policy to the conservative worldview. Because she says, well, I'm going to be the first woman president, and I can't take progressive or liberal positions on things because I'll be attacked. So therefore, I have to take a conservative position in foreign policy and military policy. And I can't take any kind of thing other than a simply moderate position on all my domestic policies. That's why I've become the chairperson of the Democratic Leadership Council policy programs. You know, she's not going to advocate any kind of effective health program system or anything. She's going to leave the insurance companies right in the center of the health program policies, you know, that take up, you know, 40% of every dollar in the entire health care budget. She's just not going to do that. Not because she might not think she'd like to, but the fact is she and all of her political people have made a tactical decision that's what she's going to do. Barack Obama, similar problem. Barack Obama, though he's fantastic, he's a wonderful guy. He was the first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review, where I was. And everybody I've ever talked to said he's the most brilliant single individual that they've ever met. He can spend 5 minutes walking from one meeting with his staff people, handing him memos about all the details, and by the time he gets to the other meeting, he knows more about it than they do. And he's a completely genius guy. And I think he'll make the best vice president we've ever had. I think that it'd be fantastic to have him there for 8 years to be able to plan how to become the best president we've ever had. And has the highest level of credibility with all the people of color throughout the world. Fantastic. Which leaves us with John Edwards. One might wish I could say Dennis Kucinich, but it's not true. And I happen to think Dennis has some of the best policies that anyone's ever seen, mainly because I drafted them in 2004 and was his policy chief. And so they're fantastic programs, and everybody can look at them. And what I suggest to people as the first step in undertaking an exopolitical however many national polls are taken by the media. The national polls place Hillary, at 50%, and him, blah, blah. The fact of the matter is, the national news media love dialectics. And so they're going to figure out who the top two contenders are in both parties and pretend like a big dialectical contest is going on between the two of them, so they can get other people to understand it. It's like the blue team and the red team. The New York Giants plays the Dallas Cowboys. It's something people are used to. And so what they're doing is they're going to try to pose Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama in a dialectical contest with each other. But the reality of it is that the numbers on a national level don't mean anything. What really means something is in Iowa, you go to Iowa right now, and John Edwards has 29% of the votes. Barack Obama has 26%. Hillary Clinton has 23%. Okay? And the fact is, whoever wins the Iowa primary is 75% likely to win the New Hampshire primary, which is only 5 days later, because of the bounce they get out of there. Fact is, the next primary is going to be in Nevada, which John Edwards is going to win running away, because he has the endorsement of the SEIU, which is the Service Employees International Union, which is all the hotel restaurant workers in Nevada, all the gambling casinos, etc. And he's going to win that primary. And he's going to win the South Carolina primary, which means that if you win the Iowa primary and the New Hampshire primary, the Nevada primary, and the South Carolina primary, when Big Super Tuesday comes along, everybody's going to be saying, oh, I guess he's going to be the nominee, let's go vote for him. And the fact of the matter is that if that happens, we have the best chance of any of the realistic candidates, that is, consciously disqualifying all the Republicans, not only because we wouldn't have any chance of getting anywhere with them, but the fact is they don't stand more than a 45% chance of winning against whoever the Democrat is. And so that what we're looking at is we're looking at preparing for a John Edwards presidency. And if we look for a John Edwards presidency, we start trying to figure out what the steps are that we advocate as exopolitics advocates as to what should be done. And what we advocate, I suggest, is that he select as his Secretary of State Bill Clinton. And that he take as his Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare Hillary Clinton, and have her be in the cabinet. And that he take as his Vice President Barack Obama. That he take as his Secretary of Energy Al Gore, to come in to set up a genuine, absolute program for alternative energy in the United States. And that he take as his head of his Department of Interior, Robert Kennedy Jr., who spent all of these years, doing the river projects and all this stuff. I mean, you start to get people who are genuine advocates, who have proven through their life work that they believe in these particular things. And you move them in, and what we have is we have 8 years of a genuine liberal administration, taking advantage of the fact that the reactionaries have so discredited the credibility of the Republican Party that they are more vulnerable now than they have been since prior to John Kennedy's election. Okay? And that's what we need to take advantage of. And I say this not because I'm asking you all to go rushing out and just become advocates of John Edwards thing. What I'm suggesting is that if, in fact, we're going to get through this exopolitical door, you can only get to the progressive sixth paradigm worldview as the interim transitional worldview position by going through the liberal door. You've got to go through the liberal door to get to the progressive door. And what I'm suggesting is if we have 8 years of a liberal administration under the administration of John Edwards with that type of first caliber cabinet sitting around him, of all of the top level people that exist in that political party to run our country with us for 8 years, we're going to have Barack Obama as the most intelligent vice president that we've ever had, sitting there realizing that the mobilization of the baby boom generation with 85 million people in that generation that stopped the Vietnam War, that challenged the Nixon administration, et cetera, that they are going to come to life expecting a liberal agenda, and it's going to open us on to the progressive worldview. And I will bet you dollar to donuts that Barack Obama is going to realize that it is possible to move to the progressive agenda when he comes on after 8 years to become the new president. And that we will then enter into a period of a progressive administration for 8 more years. Those are the 2 steps that we need. We need 8 years of a liberal administration. We need 8 years of a progressive administration, during which time we prepare all of the policies and programs and principles of an 8th paradigm worldview. And we do all the reaching out that we can do to the extraterrestrial civilization to determine whether it's a unified civilization in the so-called Galactic Federation. Is it, in fact, do we have to approach them on a solar system by solar system basis? What's the nature of their relationship with each other? Are they cooperative with each other? Are they competitive with each other? Are they at war with each other? Is there, are all these things that we need to get answers to? We need to formulate alternative policies predicated upon what our discoveries are about those particular fundamental questions. That we need to do that. We need to develop a program that demilitarizes our space program entirely. We need to seek out and to determine what the black programs are that are going on. And the fact of the matter is that John Edwards is, I think, willing to do that. John Edwards knows that the very first thing that he has to do as the new president is apologize for what it is that the last 8 years have done. But to the United States' reputation all around the world, to the reputation of our human family in the eyes of the extraterrestrials. We have to apologize. And he's the only one that's talking about doing that. Okay? And that's the first start. And then what he's got to do is he's got to establish a forgiveness commission, just like they did in South Africa, where you bring the people to the table who have done all of these things, going all the way back, and there's no doubt about where we're all talking about where you go all the way back to. You go all the way back to November 22nd of 1963. And you talk about what it is that happened to President Kennedy and who it is that did it to the president at that time. What has been this black program that's been going on all this time? What is going on in the field of extraterrestrial intelligence? Because there are huge numbers of people inside these administrations that want that story told. Because until such time as the soul of the American people are purged of those types of deceptions, we're not going to be entitled to have communication with the extraterrestrials. Because the fact of the matter is, they will not trust us. They not only will not trust us, they should not trust us. And when I say us, I don't only mean not trust the people that did it. They shouldn't trust us because we haven't gotten ourselves together enough to do something about that. Sitting and wringing our hands together and telling each other what we think happened to the president, doesn't solve anything. What we've got to do is we've got to move through this liberal door to the progressive door into a complete new worldview. And I think that is the task of our exopolitical centers, to do that type of hard reasoning. And I happen to have been privileged to have been asked to head up the center that's down in Mexico City because of its a special kind of symbolic importance because of what occurred down there back in 1999. But we have the Exopolitical Center here near Washington. We have others. That's the task that we have to be about. And what I want to do is I want to utilize my 20 years of having been in Washington, D.C., meeting with these people and understanding These people get up and put their pants on one leg at a time, every morning. And there's nothing special about them. The fact of the matter is that we're now grown-ups. We have the right to sit at this table as equals, and we have to undertake the kind of levels of responsibility for making concrete choices about what we believe to be going on within our community. And we have an 8-year period during which to do this. And so I would suggest that as a first step, you get out and make your determination as to who you want to choose to be your new president. You make your determination as to who you want to be your new congresspeople and senators. And you try to get into position a liberal administration. And that we then all work together during this 8-year period to start to prepare a truly 8th paradigm agenda of principles, policies, and programs so that we can feed them into the new paradigm, 6th paradigm progressive administration that's going to be coming to power with Barack Obama 8 years from then. But we know where we're going. We're going to an 8th paradigm. We're going to a complete shift. And the irony is of it that during that whole process, it's an existential process pursuant to which we come to merit contact from the extraterrestrial civilization. Because you may be wondering what it is that they've been waiting for. They've been waiting for us. So let's get going and reach out to them and know what we want to ask of them, okay? Thank you very much. That's all my time. Thank you.
You're the best.